Welcome, everyone. This is Glenn Solomon with GGV Capital, and I'm excited to bring you this panel on the rise of open source here at Evolving Enterprise. GGV's been focused on open source as a model for several years, and today we have two of the leaders in the industry to help shed light on the power of open source. I'm delighted to welcome Neha Narkhede, co-founder of Confluent, the leading event streaming platform based on Kafka, which is an open source project Neha helped bring to life while she was at LinkedIn. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And Dave McJannet, CEO of HashiCorp, the leader in helping companies build for a multi-cloud world. We're proud to say at GGV that we're also an investor in HashiCorp. Welcome, Dave and Neha. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Glenn. Great to be here.
So Neha, let me start with you. I'm sure many in the audience are very familiar with Kafka, but for those who are not, could you tell us a little bit about the story of building Kafka? You know, what opportunity did you see in the market, and why did you decide to go open source with it? And how important a decision do you think that was for the incredible popularity that Kafka has had since?
Sure. To tell this story, I would have to rewind back almost a decade to when I was an engineer at LinkedIn, along with my co-founders, Jay Krebs and June Rao. We were basically tasked just sort of struggling to figure out at LinkedIn, how do we manage this barrage of data that was coming from all sorts of locations, like page views and database change capture logs, and all bring it together to feed all the different downstream systems that were trying to do some form of real-time analytics and processing. We actually did not come at it by thinking about building something new. We were actually pretty lazy. We thought, let's just try to see what's out there and see what works. And what we were presented with is essentially a conundrum. Is all the systems that were built out there for doing messaging, they wouldn't scale to the that Kafka needed to. And we looked at the offline systems and log processing systems that were able to kind of suck all that data into Hadoop and other systems, and they wouldn't do real time. And so we actually strongly felt that we needed a system that could serve as a central nervous system for a company, be able to ingest events in a streaming fashion from all sorts of locations and be able to feed it to all the different apps that needed to live in this sort of real-time streaming manner. And so that's when we created Kafka. So if you think about Kafka's origins, right, it wasn't really just about the software that developers needed to use out in the world beyond LinkedIn. It was a radical new way to think about data in general. And so we always believed that open source was not just a vehicle to sort of get developers to adopt the software. We wanted developers to adopt a mindset. And that is exactly how we went about open sourcing Kafka. Is not just sort of open sourcing the code on LinkedIn's repository. We wanted to give it an established independent community. And back then, ASF was that independent community, and that did help the rise of adoption of Kafka back then, and Confluent has just sort of increased it many-fold since then. So today, hundreds of thousands of organizations use Kafka in production.
Great, thanks. Dave, maybe you could do the same for HashiCorp. Can you tell us a little bit about the open source open source products that you've built at HashiCorp?
Yeah, sure. We have a whole host of open source projects that Armin and Mitchell and the core team from HashiCorp have created. Terraform, Vault, Consul, Nomad, Packer, Boundary, Waypoint. There are a couple more in there that became parts of the other products over time. And so there's really a whole thesis around open source being the way that infrastructure should be developed. And we took the tack slightly differently from being part of the Apache Software Foundation. We put those projects up on GitHub with an open source license and invited collaboration from the community around them. And fast forward, as much as 8 years for some of the projects and 1 year for some of the projects, you see pretty amazing participation in the open source community of developers contributing to build those products together, which is pretty fun to watch.
That's really cool. So maybe, launching off that, it sounds like open source has been very important for both your companies in terms of getting usage and some velocity behind the products. Tell us about what value open source has had to your business model? Maybe Dave, I'll ask you first.
Sure. Yeah, really two sides to it. One is around the contributions that we get and the participation from the ecosystem. I actually just did a quick check. I think Terraform Core, for example, has about 1,500 contributors to it that are not HashiCorp employees. The Terraform provider ecosystem has many, many thousands. So we get an enormous leverage in terms of lift of people contributing to the tech itself, because those are the users of the tech too. For example, hey, I'm missing this service available in Terraform because I'm using Amazon. I want to use Terraform with Amazon. So I create that support, I contribute it onto GitHub, and everybody benefits from it. So there's a huge benefit on the development side, and play that forward for the other products as well. I would suggest that in particular for the integration surface area around our core projects is really where most of the contribution comes from, and that's the real benefit of open source. And then on the distribution side, clearly, by virtue of making our products open source, the friction is removed for adoption. It allows people to discover them much more easily. And over time, we built a community of many, many hundreds of thousands of people that now are paying attention to our products, download our products, use them every day. And that is an enormous business advantage.
Great. Neha, can you share a little bit about what you're seeing with respect to open source in your business model?
Yeah, sure. There are several drivers of value of open source to Confluent. I'd say at least three that I consider particularly important. The first one is, the broad developer adoption of the core engine, which is Apache Kafka, has really led to creating a pretty natural funnel for the SaaS and enterprise product offerings that you need eventually, a couple of years down the line. The second one is, community-driven evangelism has been a really huge driver for establishing event streaming as a new category. Today, which is different from several years ago, Kafka and Confluent are really more of a building block for your data platform when you think about a company. And I think that the community has done a really great job evangelizing this concept and amplifying it. And the third one is, for a horizontal data platform like Kafka, this open source, system has actually led to the creation of a really huge ecosystem of tools. There are about, thousands of connectors that pull in and pull data out of Kafka and Confluent into all these other systems that allow that, central nervous system to come to life in a company. And that ecosystem play has been really important and hinges on it being open source. So really several drivers beyond the ones, in addition to the ones that Dave mentioned, are important to Confluent as well.
It sounds like both of you have some surface area where there's integrations, connectivity, tools, and it sounds like that's one area where you're seeing the open source community help drive velocity, which I assume makes the core products even more valuable. Dave, maybe you could talk a little bit about what that's meant for you in terms of the community itself and how you've thought about managing your community. And in particular, you as CEO have two co-founders that you work with. How much time do they spend or have they spent? And then as the company has grown, how have you resourced community management at the company to make sure that the community continues to thrive?
On the surface area question, absolutely. I think what Neha's pointing to is really by virtue of reducing the friction for consumption of these projects because they're open source, it helps accelerate the standardization in a market just because the friction being reduced. And that means, it's easier for everybody to standardize on a common messaging platform than building their own. And the market actually wants to do that. And once that starts to happen, then everybody starts building connectors to that platform. And in so doing, actually, everybody benefits, honestly. It's like I think back to the world of XML or HTML, right? When the market standardized in HTML years ago, it was good for the producer and good for the consumer, and then it became, made the market take off. And I think that dynamic is at play for all these platform layer tech. So that is important to us. We actively encourage that. We've gone through an evolution, I would say. I say in the early days, the founders themselves were the ones championing the tech. Mitchell was out there talking about Terraform at every event and managing the community interactions and the practitioner experience for when they contribute to us. As you scale, obviously, that has to change, and we've become a bit more professional in our developer relations function, so to speak. I actually think Microsoft taught the world how to do this 20 years ago. in terms of building developer evangelism as an expertise, where you create a part of your organization which is authentically committed to practitioner success, irrespective of whether they ever become a customer. Once we are able to hit a certain sort of revenue scale where we can fund that, that's what we did. We sort of carved off a part of our organization. It's probably 30 plus people dedicated today that don't develop anything and just are in charge of that ecosystem. And then we probably have another 20 people on the engineering side, which are every day trying to encourage contribution. And that's managed through a practitioner journey, lens of how do we get people consuming our products, being successful in a very kind of methodical, analytical fashion. And that's kind of where we are today. I think that's how big companies run it. That's how everybody will do it over time. And we're probably there now. Today, Armin and Mitchell really aren't involved in those communities at all. We have leads on the engineering side and the ecosystem side that do it. And I think that's the natural evolution.
But this sounds like it's a significant commitment on the part of the company. So it's not something that you can begin to de-emphasize over time as you grow.
It's an expertise. It is, for example, the person that runs developer relations for us is Adam Fitzgerald. He and I worked together years ago where he managed the Spring community of millions of people. He then spent 6 years at Amazon building that developer relations function. He spent the last few years running our developer relations function. This is a deep skill. It requires a high level of authentic connection to the developer practitioner ecosystem. But it's no less analytical than marketing is in the traditional sense to tech decision makers. It's just a different orientation. I think that is where we all end up eventually.
Got it. Neha, you were one of the co-founders of not just the company, but also seminal in building Kafka and are technical as well. How much of your time and your co-founders' time early on were you guys spending on community-oriented stuff versus building Confluent, and how has that changed over time?
So for the first few years, when Kafka was just a new project and still had its bearings, to be done, all the founders, all three of us, we spent a significant amount of time on evangelism and also community development. Perhaps as much time was spent on writing blogs and giving talks and writing long emails on the community mailing list as writing code, so much so that I strongly believe that I should have had some marketing training. But as we grew, we scaled that through two means. One is we did something interesting when we hired the early engineering team. We hired stream processing engineers out of the open source community who were actually very well respected for their evangelism, be it writing blog posts or giving talks. And we hired them early on the engineering team and gave them a hybrid role. And that, I think, really helped scale the founders' efforts to have an established voice out there about this. The second thing we did, as Dave mentioned, is hire a developer advocacy team to scale the communication to various channels that could be done to reach our community, the community conference, the blog, the online talk series, podcasts. And the third thing is, I completely agree with what Dave was saying, is this is really a muscle you need to develop. And so you have to practice and you have to work on it to sort of, make sure that this developer advocacy effort is authentic, and at the same time, teach the rest of your company, especially the marketing and the sales folks, to integrate well with it so that it ends up helping all the developers as well as the companies that end up becoming customers in the long term. So really, quite a lot of work goes in to the developer advocacy and community side of things, as much as the software development and commercialization.
I'll just echo that point, Glenn, in that I think you have to reach a critical mass of a minimum viable audience of people paying attention to what you're doing. And the early days of any tech, that is going to come from the users themselves. I mean, the tech decision maker audience just is not familiar with what's happening. And I remember in the early Hadoop days when we were getting this going years ago in a previous life, we would run an editorial calendar of technical content that we would publish like a magazine every week to try and engage this practitioner community until it got to a certain scale, at which point it tipped. But there's no revenue coming from that for multiple years. And unfortunately, there's no shortcut. That's just what it takes.
Mitchell's fond of talking about how in the first year of Vagrant, after they launched it, I think he got up to 100 downloads. So obviously everyone mattered at that point. Now it's probably 100 per minute for most of your products.
Yeah.
Interesting. And one thing Neha mentioned that I think is quite valuable for open source companies as part of the business model is you can hire great development talent as well as evangelists out of your community to really scale fast. Am I getting that right, Dave? Did you see that at HashiCorp in the early days?
Yeah, absolutely. We would just look at GitHub for the biggest contributors for to the projects, and eventually, I think we even talked about it a little bit. They would be the subject of emails. Hey, you want to join us? What we're doing, and come and talk about the stuff. And yeah, that's one of the real benefits you get of open source is you get participation from wherever the expertise might be, and they self-identify in a way that is not possible in other software development paradigms. And I think this openness is really kind of a unique thing that GitHub enables. And so we can actually identify folks and hire much more quickly than we could have previously. And then obviously you get the dynamic of people watching the repos that are under development as well. And so sort of there's a long tail of people that, some of those become our evangelists if they're not necessarily the contributors themselves. So yes.
The contributors and the spectators can all be valuable.
Yeah.
And okay, so I want to flip the conversation a little bit to, from open source and its benefits and dynamics around product creation to the commercial side of your businesses. Neha, maybe I'll start with you. Talk to us a little bit about the early days of connecting this open source momentum to a commercial motion as well. How did you guys do that? Were you as founders also the salespeople for the company early on? And how did you transition to kind of focusing more on building a revenue stream?
Yeah, when Confluent was created, was really at a point in time. In fact, I remember, one of the meetings where when I was at LinkedIn, me and my co-founder were sitting in a room and talking to a company just for free to help them through their Kafka usage. And I was just sort of sitting there and thinking, wow, this, Kafka has hit a certain level of adoption in Fortune 500 that it deserves a company to exist around it. So really, when we started Confluent was really when Kafka was already in production at really the largest corporations out there. So the fact that the company was established was a pretty big driver for those companies to kind of come in and ask for help. And so really, I think the first few years of Confluent were, how do we sort of, deal with this inbound motion and how do we best convert it into a commercial, sort of motion for the company. So, it was a fine balance as it is between offering sort of the hands-on self-starting developer experience of open source software with the hands-on sales and customer success motions that enterprise software requires. In fact, not pushing developers to talk to salespeople when they don't need to and not leaving the CTOs and VPs high and dry by limiting access to sales and customer success. And if you think about it, the product-driven growth model that has worked so well for well-designed SaaS services has actually had its root in how open source-driven commercial software adoption has worked in the past, where a large sort of community downloads it without any help at all, and over a period of time gains enough interest where they reach back into the main commercial entity to ask for help. And so that is essentially what happened is we had a huge community reaching in. They were either asking for help on their on-premise software, or they were asking for help, in the last few years for their public cloud software. And so that's really what ended up happening is this, sort of natural motion where we hired a sales team around to convert this inbound interest into either interest into the open core offering or the SaaS offering, and that continues to grow really fast.
Okay, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about open core versus SaaS in a moment, but Dave, maybe similar question for you. When you joined the company, some of the open source products were starting to get more popular. What were the early days like in trying to figure out ways to close that loop and get into commercialization that worked for you guys?
Yeah, so we had a slightly different journey where we, Kafka became really popular really quickly, which was it was kind of amazing to watch, and our products took a bit longer to burn in. So what we actually spent the first part of our life doing was not worrying too much about the commercial side, and really just trying to create market standardization. And I think we probably spent years doing that even before I arrived. how do we actually create a model whereby we can create network effects that will be flywheels around us? And that comes from the contributions, the provider ecosystem, that sort of stuff. So really focused on that part for a long time. When it came time to commercialization, we too found that same issue, that we were kind of being pulled into some of these bigger companies who were saying, hey, we're running this stuff in production. And we're like, you're what? We're not expecting that to happen. And then we're faced with the challenge, hey, we've created this giant community. So how are we going to monetize it? And I think Mitchell's comment that I heard him make, which I thought was so accurate, he said, hey, in the world of open source, if you aggregate 1 million people and say, if I can just get 1% of them to pay me, I'll be able to build a business, runs up against the reality that you've aggregated a community of people with a propensity not to pay you. So your monetization model better not be about monetizing those people. It better be about something else. And I think for us, that was, got it. Practitioners are going to use this stuff. We're going to build a separate set of products then that focus on the organizational complexity of people running those products at scale. So sort of separating the idea of technical complexity and organizational complexity. And that became the paradigm we used for monetization. And as in so doing, you allow the network effects to run for the end user because you're not taking anything away from them. In fact, all this allows you to do is to invest more in the goodness for the practitioner. You know, we today, we actually just did a review yesterday. We did 1 release per month of all 8 of our products last year. That's an enormous amount of engineering that is not possible unless we have a revenue engine to fund it. So I think that was how it evolved, was not trying to monetize the users themselves, but try to say, like, what's the organization that they work for? What are their problems? Oh, it's collaboration, it's policy, it's governance. It's not a technical problem at all, and focused on that. And that's been our model ever since.
So for companies with more of an open core model, one key question that always arises, and this is even true in companies with SaaS, is what do I put in open source? What do I keep for commercial benefit? It sounds like for you guys, Dave, at HashiCorp, one paradigm has been technical complexity versus organizational complexity and features built to help organizations manage that technical complexity better. Is that the right way to think about how you guys have navigated what goes in open source versus what goes in commercial?
For us, it has been, yes. There's some group of people that just want to have a relationship with you around your products, but that's the minority. It's more about this, you have to find an adjacent problem that people want to have you solve, and then solve that for them.
Neha, talk to us a little bit at Confluent, how you guys have thought about building commercial features around Kafka, and then talk about this transition that you've had to really much more of a cloud-focused solution as opposed to a self-managed or on-prem open core.
Right. For us, we've followed where the users have taken us as they increase their adoption of the software after adopting it for the first initial use case. So the way Kafka gets adopted in a company is individual lines of businesses, apps, and their engineers can adopt Kafka, and they kind of figure out how to deploy it for their own use case. And over a period of time, between 0 to 3 years, hundreds of apps are all of a sudden using Kafka, and Confluent has to come in to kind of establish some order in this chaos and kind of help the company establish a central, platform use of the software. And what does that entail? That entails thinking about, multi-cloud setups. That entails thinking about, geo sort of optimized setups. And it has a lot of governance and data management features that usually developers, when they think about their own piece of the puzzle, don't really care about those things. So that's the natural separation for us, is anything that developers need to get started with Kafka is absolutely in the open source product, and anything the company needs to manage these hundreds of apps using Kafka, that kind of naturally falls in Confluent's domain. And while that, Confluent is a central nervous system, so it has to be wherever your events are. And for a long time, they used to be on premises, and that's why we started with a self-managed product. And naturally, in the last 10 years, if we've all have seen, the move to the public cloud has become, quite fast. And so that essentially what that means for a central nervous system is now you have to expand beyond one environment to really a hybrid setup where you have some data in on-premise data centers, some data in one public cloud. And now what we see is some data across multiple public clouds, and they sort of have this, data highway running underneath the covers, orchestrating all that. And that has naturally been, that has led to a hybrid product and business model for Confluent, where no matter how you deploy the software, we are everywhere and we're orchestrating that multi-cloud hybrid setup.
Very interesting. Dave, you guys, have made a bunch of cloud announcements over the past few months, quarters, and are starting to launch cloud products. Maybe you could talk about what that transition's been like, and where you think, the next set of great open source companies are going to come from. Are they going to be more cloud focused to start? And if there's something about the market that's now shifting?
Yeah, I think infrastructure is a peculiarly specific thing in these market categories. I think so. I think if you think about the layers of software, there's sort of the database layer, the messaging layer, the runtime layer, the application platform, and then there's the core infrastructure which underpins all of these applications. And what we've observed is there's sort of a slightly higher bar for people to consider having you run their infrastructure for them as opposed to their application platform for them. And so as a result, all of our products, when we started them, are designed to be self-managed. People, yes, they run them in Amazon or Azure or on-prem, but they're self-managed. And it may seem like a curious thing given that we are an infrastructure provider and all of our products are used to enable cloud offerings, but it turns out the market appetite for self-managed at the enterprise level is very, very high, just because if your network goes down, everything goes down. If your database goes down, the database goes down, right? And so as a result, the market's been a bit slower to be willing to accept managed services for the infrastructure layer things, really like deep infrastructure, like identity-based security or service-based networking. So we were a bit later to announce our cloud offerings, and I think that explains why we're just really meeting the market where it is. We launched a cloud version of Terraform about a year ago, and there's clearly strong resonance for that. We released a cloud version of Consul and of Vault as well on Amazon recently, and you can see from the uptick to that, it is what you would expect. There are maybe there are 1,000 companies on the Vault class on the Vault beta. It's full in public beta. Probably 60 of those are Fortune 2000 companies. The other 1,900 are smaller organizations, which is what you would expect. So I would think seriously about where you fit in the infrastructure, in the software stack, and I would think seriously about what part of the market you want to service. If you want to service the infrastructure stack and the enterprise, it'll be a long time before they're willing to consume a managed service from you as the primary way. There will be some, but that's not the lion's share of the market. I think that's maybe a good taxonomy to look at. So there's plenty of white space. I would say the higher up the stack you are, the more willingness there is to consume it as a managed service, which is obviously the way that we all want to provide our services because of the unit economics associated with it. But you sort of have to respect the market and the buyer. And ultimately, this is about how people want to buy stuff from you. People don't swipe their credit card and buy Vault. They just don't. It's too important. That's a considered decision. They may do that for an app, in which case that's the way to monetize that.
In a world where both of your companies are providing cloud services now, you have some potential risk of competition with the cloud vendors. They could also be partners of yours. Curious how you're trying to make sure you end up on the right side of that equation and manage that delicate balance. Neha, maybe I could ask you.
Yeah, I think that at this point, we're at a point in the market where all the stakeholders understand that this is a balancing act of partnering in some ways and competing in others where it makes sense. So for instance, partnering to build the best customer experience for a popular third-party service through a cloud provider's marketplace offering, it actually serves both the cloud provider as well as the third-party vendor well in ultimately serving the customer in the best way possible. Now, at the same time, there's an obvious competitive dynamic between the respective product teams of the cloud provider on one side, often a bare bones version of the managed service versus your SaaS service of the same software. But I think ultimately it's going to come down to whether the market believes that best of breed services are better or best of suite, and whether the cloud provider lock-in is worth it versus diversifying across multiple cloud providers by using independent third-party SaaS services. I think the jury is still out there on that. There are initial sort of indications of a trend going much more towards the best of breed services and multi-cloud, but really we have to see that fully play out. But I think it is a fine balancing act between partnering on the go-to-market side and competing on the product side if it does make sense for the particular product in mind. And that has been the way Confluent has worked thus far with all the public cloud providers.
Great. Dave, you get the last word on this topic.
Well, we have a bit of a different dynamic because our core value proposition is multi. So I think hard about the positioning of in the market if you can, and the value proposition of multi. If that truly is the value proposition, it's less likely that a cloud provider has an incentive to do that. We also think about it slightly differently, which is when I think about what the cloud providers want, they want to be able to have customers build applications that land on Amazon, consume data on Amazon, and stay there. And they want to use the Amazon specific services because that's what spins the compute meter. How they get there, they don't really have as much of a point of view on. They're just trying to get workloads. So, speaking for us specifically, how we view it is, hey, we very deliberately participate at the lower end of the infrastructure stack. We just provide a common way to do provisioning, a common way to do identity-based security, a common way to do networking. And actually that's in harmony with the cloud providers because they're trying to figure out how to onboard applications seamlessly. They're actually not trying to sell you those things. Yes, they will sell you a load balancer, but they don't make money on the load balancer. So whether that comes through our service-based networking, they're kind of ambivalent. So that's how we navigate it, is basically through a positioning exercise of number one, building for multi, number two, positioning ourselves at the infrastructure layer where we're actually accretive to the clouds. And ironically, we won Partner of the Year from Azure last year and from Google last year, which sort of speaks to the value proposition being authentically true. But I think this is something that you have to deeply think about. I will say I run quarterly business reviews with all the cloud providers as high up as we can get because I need them to understand the value at the highest level and not have a product manager and some team along the way say, hey, we could just do that, because I can tell you it makes no sense for that company. It might make sense for that business, and that is something you have to navigate sometimes. So I would be eyes wide open about their incentives is perhaps the best way to think about it.
Well, I think we're all going to be eyes wide open, watching for great future news out of both Confluent and HashiCorp. The future seems really bright for both of your companies. I want to thank you both, Neha and Dave, for sharing thoughts with us today here at Evolving Enterprise. It's been a great conversation and really looking forward to the future for both your companies. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.